The order I put into the chat for those in the waiting room, I will put it into the chat again here so you can get your drams pour. Oh, that's not the right one. That's the thing that I copied and put onto Facebook for a description. Here, this is what you actually want. I'll fire this in the chat. This is the order of the whiskeys tonight. So starting with the Secret Speyside, Ben Nevis, Old Rhosdhu, Ardmore, Blended Malt 30 year, Springbank 94, and Lechig. So that is the order we're going to be tasting them in. And yeah, I can see some stragglers, especially in Calgary. I can see James in Vancouver has joined us, and Sammy, who's on Vancouver Island, where it is only 4 p.m. So gentlemen, thank you for skipping out of work. James, I guess you could call this work, even though it's not your brands, but nevertheless, nice to have you. And just checking to see if we've got, oh, I see Benoit in Montreal. So yeah, we've got a spread. We've got Igor in Toronto, Dave in Vancouver, and some other folk in between. So awesome. While we're waiting for the last couple of people to make their way in, as we always do, I'm just going to quickly highlight a couple of upcoming events we've got. We're going to get started here promptly because it is late where Angus is joining us from tonight. But Saturday in store, we've got Bob Baxter from Yukon Brewing and Distilling for a Yukon single malt tasting. This is a distillery we're pretty excited about as far as Canadian craft distilleries go. Some of their whiskey is now over 10 years of age. And I think they're such a fascinating company because they started with the concept of a brewer making whiskey, and there's some guys to look out for. That's sold out. Oh, if you're in Calgary, our final festival of the season, the Spring Single Malt Festival, is on Thursday night. Still 14 tickets left for that. Our next festival won't be until November, so look out for that. And then maybe the last one I'll highlight here quickly, Renegade Rums with Jane Nurse. We're going to be talking Mark Renier's other project, and all things rum. So those are things coming up. Most of you know where to find those. At least you have to if you signed up for these tastings online, but I'll put it in the chat. But that's not why you're here tonight. You're here tonight to taste some Spongeworthy single malts. Not all of them actually Whisky Sponge bottlings. We've got at least one NAS bottling as well. And I'll let Angus talk to that. But Angus, thank you for joining us live from Scotland tonight, where it is late. You have a small child, you were recently married, and you're a trooper to stay up with us and talk whiskey. So thanks for joining us. And you do have to unmute yourself again. There we go.
Yeah, well, no, thanks very much for having me, and thank you very much for putting on this tasting. And yeah, we really appreciate the effort you guys do for us. And also, it's just nice to through the magic of the interweb talk to other fellow whiskey nerds from around the world. And yeah, so very happy to do it, very happy to be here. Yeah, so we've got quite a nice selection of bottles today. The spread you've put on is pretty sexy. So there's some nice drams. We'll chat through them, I'll introduce them, I'll say a bit about them. But I'm also very happy to answer questions. I'm happy to receive criticism. I'm a sponge for critique as much as whiskey. So if you've got questions, if you've got comments, just absolutely fire them out. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as we go along. But yeah, so kicking off with dram number 1. And I'll talk a bit about Decadent Drinks and about Sponge as we sip through this, but I'll just introduce dram number 1 first, which is our Whisky Sponge edition number 73. And it is a secret Speyside, even though the label, as you may notice, gives heavy suggestion that it would be a Glen Grant. And I can tell you it is a Glen Grant. Glen Grant 2003. And I love Glen Grant. It's one of my favorite distilleries. I don't know what it is about it. I think it's just got such effortless class about it. And in particular, in my old life as someone who used to focus on old and rare whiskies and do a lot of work around sort of auctions, antique bottles, and involved a lot in luckily in tasting those sorts of whiskies, I was very fortunate enough to taste a lot of old Glen Grants, and I just really love a lot of the sort of more distillate focused Glen Grants. I think it's a distillery, one of the few distilleries that managed to hang on to a little bit more of a distillate character and style a bit later in its life, which not all distilleries did. So this is 2003 vintage. It's matured in one single refill hogshead, and we bottled it at natural cask strength, 51.2, I think. And this is the story behind this. The reason we weren't allowed to name it is the people that we bought it from said this was a parcel that the distillery themselves sold into the broker's market because it didn't fit their profile for single malt or for blending, because the malt used to make it was lightly peated. Now, how much peat you actually detect in this, I'd be interested to get your feedback on, because I never found it hugely peaty, but this was what was written down, it was on the sheets, it was what was on the sort of detail of the cask from the broker. So, and I do detect, I suppose, a little thread of that in there, but mostly what I like about this whiskey is I just find it abundantly fresh. I find it very immediate, very pleasurable, very fresh, and I think a pretty accurate and natural and unvarnished expression of Glen Grant's modern distillery character, which is very barley focused, but there's good weight to it. There's a little oiliness, there's a little weight in the mouth. And the thing that I've always loved about Glen Grant, a lot of people associate Glen Grant with sherry, the old bottlings. But to me, Glen Grant was always about very naked, refilled, distillate driven, very natural style of malt whiskey. If you want to talk to another local evangelical in Canada about Glen Grant, speak to Igor, because he is the Glen Grant ambassador for Canada, essentially, unofficially. But it's one of those things where if you go to old bottle festivals and you see someone with a Glen Grant, you like do a secret handshake, and you have to both go into a cupboard and talk about Glen Grant for 2 hours. So yeah, I'm always very happy whenever we get to do one. We've bottled 3 so far. No, 4. We've bottled 4 Glen Grants so far. But this one was the most recent, and I think probably the most accessible. Straightforward, single cask, refill hogshead, 18 years old, I think we bottled it. And just lovely, mature, easy, accessible, natural sweetness. It's got sweetness, but it's not sweetness that's dominated by wood influence. It's sweetness that really comes from the raw ingredients. You've got the barley coming through, and yeah, I really love this style. I'd be curious to know what people think of it, if anyone's actually detecting any kind of phenolic signature at all, or because yeah, I find this whole lightly peated thing rather ethereal and hard to pin down. I'm curious.
I'm not personally picking up anything that could be like explained by something like barrel char or something after all this time. Like if there's smoke there, it's incredibly faint. And even if it was 2 to 5 ppm or something like that in the malt, like after 19 years, you're not going to get much of that anymore anyway. So I'm not getting it. I just want to ask really quickly, because I love the label on this, and like I instantly knew what this was when I saw the label. Not because of Glen Grant itself, but because of the Gordon MacPhail 40s and 50s bottlings that used to be cheap as chips, which, as you said, were also typically more on the sherried side. But was there any concern that like anyone would take issue with kind of approximating?
I suppose there's an element of concern, but not enough concern to stop me doing it, if that makes sense. Like yeah. I looked into this a little bit. There's essentially a thing where any artistic work enters the public domain after 75 years, and that label is 100% been used for more than 75 years. Like, in fact, I will show you seconds. So like, here's an example of this bottle. That label, that's a bottle from the 1930s. So that label has essentially still been used since, and there's even earlier examples going back to, as far as I'm aware, into the 19th century. So it's, as far as I'm aware, completely fine for me to rip it off and not get sued by Gordon MacPhail or the distillery. It doesn't say Glen Grant anywhere on the bottle, so I'm pretty confident that everything's fine. And we have had no letters or anything like that. So there's another example that Igor's holding up. That's looks like a sort of 60s version there. But it's a very old label. It's one of the oldest, most continually used labels in Scotch whisky. And so when I got the sheet, this is part of the fun of Decadent Drinks. So really, like, taking a step back here, like, Decadent Drinks is about having fun, and we take quality of content very seriously. Like, I really care that the liquid that's in our bottles is good quality and delicious, and as we'll go along tonight as well, also sometimes like extreme or divisive, or the sort of whiskey that you cannot not have a conversation about when you're tasting it. That's what I want in our products. But beyond that, I want to have fun with it. And, you know, you're doing a very simple thing when you're indie bottling. You're literally just picking nice whiskey and putting it in bottles. Piss easy. It's not rocket salad. Like, you can just do it. And the challenge, I think, in it is finding ways to be creative and finding ways to do something a bit different or go the extra mile. So that's where things like labels come in. Like, you know, we're just bottling into 70 cl tall round bottles. So what can we do with labels? And I always try to think of ways we can have fun and do something, you know, a bit different or satirical or silly or surreal. So when it comes to things like unnamed distilleries, I view that as a challenge. Like, when we get casks of Clynelish, I just invented a new name for Clynelish. I called it Candle Kitty, and now everyone knows exactly what's in those bottles whenever we do it. With this Glen Grant, like, we weren't allowed to name it, so I thought, well, fine, I'll just use a Glen Grant label and not use the words Glen Grant, and everyone will know exactly what it is. So yeah, it's about finding fun ways through. Like, the time we got a cask of Glenmorangie, which we knew was Glenmorangie, but we weren't allowed to call it Glenmorangie. So I just put a giraffe and a bunch of dildos on the label, and everyone knew it was Glenmorangie. So it's fine.
Problem solved.
Yeah, that was edition 7, I think.
Yeah.
It's a long time ago. I've since tried to do a similar label and got told I wasn't allowed. So yeah.
Was that the Scotch Whisky Association, or like a legal?
That was our bottler. Our bottler said, I think since that happened, that was only like nearly 3 years ago, 2019 or early 2020. And since then, I'm sure there's been some sort of clause saying you can't have any references to anything sexual on labels. Now, there's arguments to be had here about exactly what counts as sexual, but yeah, apparently the sponge in a gimp suit being paddled by like a steam-driven malting shovel wheel is not allowed. So that's a label that's in the could have been sponge archive.
I think by banning that label, they're discriminating against certain groups of people with certain pursuits.
I definitely think so. I agree, and I'm planning to cancel the Scotch Whisky Association on behalf of BDSM lovers everywhere, any day now.
There you go. Just Doug Page brought up a comment here that Caperdonic, which obviously was for a long time called Glen Grant #2, was doing some peated malt back at this point in time. So it might have been, you know, an accidental shipment or something. You know, who knows? But an interesting point.
This happened a lot, by the way, and it's probably the right answer as to why something like this would have happened, which is the wrong delivery of malt. Like, there's a whole series of Macallan called the Travel Series, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, with some of them having more peat in than others. That series literally exists because they got the wrong shipment of malt and just decided to produce with it anyway, and they made heavily peated Macallan, and then they were like, what do we do with this heavily peated Macallan? So yeah, it's pretty common, especially in Speyside, where most of the distilleries generally don't make peated malt.
Yeah. Here's something I've often wondered, Angus, like, especially in the 80s and 90s, how closely would the employees at some of these distilleries be even paying attention to the spec of their malt? And would some of those people have even cared if it was accidentally not the right spec?
No, I I think managers and I think, you know, senior production staff at distilleries were paying attention because they had to an extent, because even in the 90s, like I would say even more, especially in the 90s and even earlier 80s, even if the distilleries were not producing the same volume, they were still producing very predominantly for blends. And I would say even more so, like what's happened since is that the proportion of the recipe or the proportion of production has gone, you know, more towards single malts than blends, even though blends still dominate. But in the 90s and 80s, blends were almost everything. So it was almost more important to have uber consistency of make. So I think that there's an element that you're always going to have people in businesses like this in production where, you know, one guy just doesn't care or doesn't notice. And also the people that are delivering malt are going to care even less. Like, we jockey, the lorry driver is going to be like, I'm fucking leaving this malt here, fuck it, and just drive away. And then the staff have got to deal with it. So there's all these sorts of, you know, secondary supply chain issues and things you've got to, you know, factor into those kind of scenarios. But yes, absolutely. These things definitely happen to distilleries for all sorts of reasons. And it's just, I think it's just the nature of a rather sort of complex, convoluted, integrated industry with various tiers and chains and stuff.
Kurt, Harmony, either of you guys want to share any thoughts on this one before we move on?
Me?
Ladies first, that's right, Kurt. You got to unmute.
I don't think she's going to.
I can. I was just letting you go first because I feel like my thoughts have been echoed in the chat already, but it's beautiful and so easy to drink. It's refreshing. We're going through a bit of a heat wave over here. James said it was 30 degrees where he is yesterday. This is like the perfect kind of summertime scotch with tons of complexity. And I love, after all that citrus fruit, as you said, Angus, that barley just shines on the finish. This is the perfect whiskey.
It's a nice way to think of it, a summertime dram. I hadn't perhaps thought of it that way, but it definitely makes sense. Like you could totally be really kind of decadent and just have this as a highball and it would work really well.
Sean and I were just waxing poetical in the shop about Glen Grant and Glen Keith the other day. Beautiful example, the way you described it at the beginning, just that kind of effortless elegance. I love that. And Andrew, you got to probably think too, this is right in that wheelhouse you and I love, refill, hoggies kind of thing, with a bit of time on them. The only way this whiskey gets better for me is if it was a slightly deader barrel, another 5 or 6 years on it. This is a rock star for what it is and the absolute epitome of what I would look for in a refill hoggy from that kind of area. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Sorry, Angus, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, I've tried some other casks from this parcel and they're starting to tip over now that they're getting comfortably towards like 19, 20 years old, and they are starting to tip over into more of a kind of like properly aged waxy territory. This one was just kind of on the cusp of that, and I think it's a nice little twilight zone to catch it in. Yeah, so shall we talk about dram number 2?
Yeah, let's do it.
Even taste it as well, who knows?
No, just people have to look, they don't get to taste.
Well, so
no, this isn't a gym.
Remember what I said a few minutes ago about enjoying doing or putting out like quite extreme whiskies? This is an extreme whiskey we're about to try, dram number 2, and it's a very divisive whiskey, and I expect a sort of a cross section of opinion. So this is Whisky Sponge edition number 58A. It's a Ben Nevis 1996. It's 25 years full term maturation in a refill butt, and it's a style of whiskey I like, which is really bare naked, distillate driven, very, very textural. It's really barley eau de vie. It has so little to do with wood, although the wood is incredibly important in the sense of how hands off it is. This is a very naked, distillate driven whiskey. in fact, I think you've quoted me here on this page, is a hyper distillate driven, almost ideologically refill profile of Ben Nevis 96. So you kind of have to like this, like very bare naked style. I love it, but it absolutely is a style which probably has its fans and has its detractors, and it's absolutely the sort of whiskey that if you pour this blind for a bunch of good whiskey chums around a table, I reckon you would get a whole host of reactions and no correct guesses. So it's a very fun whiskey. It's a very fun bottling. And I like especially the palate on this whiskey. I really find the nose it shows the youth, but on the palate you get a real thick textural hit of fruit and mineral oil and wax, and it's very, very grungy. It's very, very like raw. You get the sense of the sort of Ben Nevis dirtiness of the distillery. Like you feel like you're sort of tasting a Ben Nevis smoothie. Lots of like actual distillery gunge, and you could almost be drinking the contents of the low wines and feints receiver when you're tasting this.
I agree with you. I think the palate has more to redeem it than the nose. There is something about the nose that I think people chasing like those legendary 96 Ben Nevis that get kind of tropical and gooey and funky are probably looking for. And we've had a few of these. Like we've had some from Hunter Lang. We've had some from Boutique as well that are in that same age statement that don't kind of go in that mold. And this is a little bit like that. It's got this sort of beef bouillon, savory, meaty sort of note on the nose, but I think it settles down nicely on the palate.
It has so we like it's quite the opposite from the other 96 Ben Nevis we bottled as, I think it was, I want to say Whisky Sponge edition 52. What was it? Oh, where's it gone? Yeah, edition 52. So that was very much in the style that you outlined there, that kind of really gungy, overripe, thick tropical fruit wax kind of profile, much more cask influence and much more sort of maturity. And this is sort of opposite end of the spectrum, where I don't think you would guess this was 25 years old if you had it blind. But within that, knowing that, I think it makes it a very fascinating whiskey. I also think this is the sort of whiskey which in 10, 20 years will probably show rather differently from bottle. I do think this, and the fact we bottled this with reduction, we bottled it at 53%. So I think this, given another 10, 20 years in bottle, is going to start to show in probably quite a different way. But yeah,
so that's, you're talking about like bottle effects, like essentially.
I think more, yes, to an extent, bottle effect, but more like just bottle aging. Like I think a lot of like spirits, especially ones that have been bottled with a bit of reduction, tend to benefit from some years in bottle, because when you add water to a mature cask of whiskey, you create a lot of quite vigorous chemical reactions, and I think they're still ongoing. I would say it's even more extreme if you mix two casks together that are mature at the point of being mixed, and then you bottle them straight away. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on in those bottles that needs to settle down. And there's a reasonable amount of anecdotal evidence now from people that have done this for long enough to say these bottles change as they get. Now, of course, humans change as they get older as well. But I think there's a reasonable weight of anecdotal evidence saying that bottles do change, whiskies do change. The character is not totally static, and that certainly whiskies bottled at a good strength that are malt whiskies, they tend on balance to improve, provided the bottle remains in reasonable storage condition.
Here's a question for you. Like we talked about with the Glen Grant about how it was supposedly a peated or lightly peated style. Is there a chance that there's a touch of smoke in this? Because I'm actually getting something more of a smoke note or a peat note in this than I was in the Glen Grant.
It's entirely possible, but I think Ben Nevis is generally just a fuller bodied, fatter spirit anyway. It's also possible that the butt it was in before it held a peated malt. And it's possible that they did a parcel with some lightly peated malt at the distillery in '96. I think that it's just perhaps more to do with the fact that Ben Nevis is a sort of fuller bodied, greasier, generally waxier, fatter spirit anyway, with more sort of these oily long chain congeners in the spirit, which can sometimes, deliver characteristics like medicine, or so things that sort of belong in a similar flavor group or family as phenolics or peat might do. So I'm talking about old Chartreuse, not only Chartreuse, I think a lot of liqueurs, because of all the complexity of the ingredients, the sort of, 10, 20, 30, 100 different herbs, roots, honeys, whatever, all these mixes. There's a lot of nice liqueurs that age beautifully in bottle. I've got a bottle of 1940s Drambuie on the shelf, which is essentially just Talisker and honey, and it's fucking incredible. But it's also like illegal. I'm pretty sure that if you have more than 3 CL, you'll get diabetes.
Yeah, that's like Iron Brew. So
kind of. I mean, we Scots are, we're immune to that now. So yeah.
Well, it's a generational thing, right? You develop a resistance over time.
Scottish women do milk in one boob and Iron Brew in the other. So it's just we're weaned on it,
That's right. Okay, Kurt, maybe we'll let you go first this time. Do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, those 96s are pretty legendary, but this is not one of the ones that I'm keenest on, to be honest. I sit on the other side of the spectrum. I look for more of those tropical, kind of tangy notes on the palate, especially. There's a little bit of it towards the back end, but this one, like you said, a little bit meaty, like dirty, waxy kind of. I got some Ovaltine notes, a little bit of vegetal background. It's kind of like, I like that you said peat, because I'm not sure if it's peat for me, but it's really close to that. It's kind of like a dirtier version of Ardmore or a cleaner version of Lechig somehow to me. It's kind of where it's sitting on the palate right now. And the back end of it is kind of like a port cask for some reason on the palate. That's not finished.
Cool. Harmony?
Yeah, it definitely shows the age on the nose a little bit. But my first thought was like old books, library kind of paper. And then you showed the label and this guy's like holding a clipboard. And I was like, that's what I'm tasting. I'm tasting a clipboard. But I actually like it. I definitely found like some creaminess in there. I do think, a little bit of peat or something of the sort. But yeah, it's maybe not like my everyday grab, but I enjoy it.
Oh,
and
cool.
That was very polite, Harmony. Thank you.
Yeah. And also remember, guys, that I remember when I brought first time the Nevis 96 to Canada, it was like 5 years ago or 6 years ago. Nobody even touched it. Despite it actually was already fruit bomb. And I was like shrugging my shoulders and didn't understand why people didn't drink it. It's so good. But even at that point of time, it was quite a few different characters of the Ben Nevis. So I came across of the casks like this. I came across of the pretty fruity casks. But for me, it's just a whiskey that's showing the definitely character of the distillery, because actually the fruit bombs, Ben Nevis fruit bombs, it's not typical Ben Nevis. It's kind of oddity, I would say.
Well, I can't say that I myself have been exposed to a lot of Ben Nevis, especially the 96 venture that everyone keeps talking about, how they're like continuing this wonderful profile within those years. I don't have that experience to back anything up, but Ben Nevis has always had like this kind of meaty profile that I've enjoyed. It's just like for today. I mean, I'm basing it on for today, of course, like what I enjoy drinking today. And the first one's hitting it for me, but I really like the funkiness of the nose on this.
Harmony, I'm going to have to bring into the shop. We did a cask of 96 single malts of Scotland Ben Nevis that was like a goopy tropical dram. I'll have to bring that in for you to try because it's a night and day different style. But Angus, you started us off on this one saying that it's going to be a divisive whiskey. Not everyone's going to love it. I'm somewhere in the middle on this one. I can't make up my mind because I have absolutely detested some of the other ones I've seen that are like this, that are just, they taste like they're corked or there's like a wet dog funkiness to them. But this one's got enough of a redeeming palate to it that like I would happily enjoy it. It's a curiosity to me.
Yeah.
And as Igor said, it's going to show you a different side of the distillery. So it's interesting. So I'm in the middle of Curtin Harmony on this one, but to keep things rolling, why don't we move on to the Rhosdhu?
Yeah,
I
so
look
this
forward to trying this like like when we get back to it, just with a little time in the glass.
Yeah, for sure.
So the Rhosdhu is a bit of a gear shift. So this is Old Rhosdhu single malt, which is a malt made at Loch Lomond distillery. They don't make this recipe anymore. This was pot distilled single malt made at Loch Lomond. I believe from like 1966 to like 2000, 2002, something like that. So if you see Rhosdhu now, Rhosdhu, the name at Loch Lomond, is used to make peated malt or lightly peated malt put through a column still. So technically grain whiskey. But this is single malt, and this is made in 1993. So filled 93, matured for 29 years in a refill hogshead, and we bottled this with about 2 degrees reduction to 57.1. So the strength was super high. And like a lot of the Loch Lomond malts from this time period, the early 90s, certainly after 93, there was a lot of playing around because they also owned at the time Little Mill, and Little Mill had just closed. And so a lot of the whiskies at this time period, like Inchmarrin and Old Rhosdhu in particular, they were messing around with the recipes to make something that replicated Little Mill to replace it in the blends.
Well, now you're talking Benoit's language.
Yeah, so Little Mill notoriously very fruity, and from those eras, like late 80s into the early 90s and into its last days of production, Little Mill had a lot of inherent fruitiness in the spirit that certainly showed when it got to greater ages. And I think that's what you get here with this Rhosdhu, is that they really, you can sort of see what they were doing, what they were playing around with. And these are whiskies which didn't necessarily show well when young. Like a lot of the young Little Mills are just like very, very raw, plain, cardboardy. I think these whiskies from this sort of era and this distillery, these owners, I should say, they tended to have a lot of precursors in them which needed age to really come out and show at their best. So what I find about this is you just get a really kind of lovely tart fruitiness about it. So I think of things like kiwis and grapefruits and like dried exotic fruits, fruit teas, but also what I really like as well is there's a sense of Irishness about it, which I tend to find in a lot of Loch Lomond malts, is that they seem like they're cosplaying as Irish whiskies. And this kind of nettles, Sauvignon Blanc, crushed grass kind of vibe that I get out of it, and this sort of olive oil note as well. They're lovely, textural, quite charismatic whiskies, and they play around with weight and texture, but also lightness and subtlety, and in a way that, you know, makes me think of things like Redbreast and Cooley. And so yeah, there's a lot to be said for this. I really like it. I bottled it.
Angus, I've been a fan of some of these older 20-something Rhosdhus, especially when they get to that, like as you said, that really fruity, over the top style, which I think was what they were going for at the time, is they were trying to accentuate kind of that fruitier new make spirit. But I'm glad you brought in the comparison to Little Mill. And I know Benoit in Montreal is a huge Little Mill fan, but I've always been kind of found Little Mill a bit of a struggle, because I find I either really like it, or I find it's just like the palate is just, there's something missing. It's like this empty, waxy, fruity layer that just doesn't have anything in it. And do you think that might be because those Little Mills were too young, that they just didn't have enough time to develop?
I think that Little Mill has also been a very changeable whiskey over the years. Like if you try the 60s ones, even at older ages, they tended to show in a quite a weird way. It's sort of like this strange fusion of wax and orange juice. And conversely, the older Little Mills in terms of production era, like 60s, 70s Little Mills, showed better as 5 and 8 year olds in bottle. Whereas the latter era, 80s, 90s stuff, didn't show as well at younger ages. The last era of things like Little Mill 8 to 12 year old were not great bottlings. But those same stocks that were just left to linger in cask, it's just plain hoggies and barrels for, 25 to 30 plus years, they show far better. They really have developed a lovely sort of, again, quite Irish fruitiness, this kind of crushed grass, crushed nettles, passion fruit, Sauvignon Blanc, like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, quite exotic fruitiness. I would say this Rhosdhu is actually a bit weightier than Little Mill. It's got I'm just tasting it again for the first time in a while, and I'm noticing like this quite sort of interesting combination of cocoa and waxiness on the palate, which I find really intriguing. And it's got a beeriness about it, like a nice creamy stout kind of, and bready note.
I think this is a beautiful bottling. That combination of the waxiness, the fruitiness, it has, like you said, a bit more of a weight to it. It's a bit thicker and heavier than you would typically get out of some Little Mills, but I think it's a lovely bottling. I would love to see how this like evolves in my glass over an hour or so, because I feel like it's like a wine that's really tight that just needs to open up a bit.
It's also a whiskey which, it's still got a long way to go with reduction. I mean, it's 57.1 after 29 years. There's a lot going on in there. It's a big whiskey, and it can take time in glass. It can take attacking with a pipette, giving several layers of reduction, and it'll keep changing, keep evolving in the glass. And, it's another one where the answer to why do we reduce this by like 1.8 degrees, whatever it was, the answer is fruit. All these whiskeys always show better with just a tiny bit of reduction. They always have a more pronounced fruit character as a result. And I'm not, we do single cask strength as well. And I know that as a kind of approach, as an ideology about bottling, it's very common, very traditional, and totally valid as well. But it's not just what we want to do at Decadent Drinks. Like I want to be able to put products on the market which wouldn't necessarily otherwise exist. And that there's sometimes an element where we say, look, we've made these decisions, we've done these things to put this product out in the way that we think it shows best. And, that's what you buy into if you buy a Decadent Drinks product, or, you buy into our decision making, you buy into our preferences, our taste, our judgment. And that's balanced by the fact we occasionally sprinkle it with just, like the Glen Grant, typical single cask strength. So it's a balance, it's a mix. But this is a good example of one where it's just been tweaked with a little bit of targeted reduction just to enhance that fruitiness. I remember when I tried this cask sample, it was great, but it was just a bit too perhaps tight and syrupy, and like what you just referenced there, Andrew, this idea of a wine that needs time to open. It had more of that factor, I would say. So it's just about trying to put the whiskey into bottle in a way which is going to show immediately and very well, but retain, I think, an element of what this whiskey has, which is really special, which is the fact it's old and still high strength and still very powerful and still concentrated and complex and big. I wanted to retain that character while just letting it open up a little bit. So
yeah,
and I think actually that Loch Lomond whiskey is actually really unique, and in my opinion, they're very interesting because basically in one distillery they're doing like 4 or 5 different whiskeys, and Rhosdhu is probably one of my favorites, if not favorite. And exactly like Angus said about the kind of Irish character or Little Mill character, and I found definitely in this bottle it's kind of those single casks of Little Mill from like 89 to 92, I think you would agree, Angus, with me on
Yeah,
that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, Angus, I just to touch on something you said earlier, because one of the guys here was asking me about, do other companies, rather than bottling it pure cask strength? And I think the reason a lot of us like cask strength is that it allows you to dilute it down if you want yourself, or drink it as it was in the cask, but it doesn't mean it's preferable. I think the boutique guys do this with some of their bottlings. They'll dilute them to a strength they feel is the best for drinking. They also do some cask strength. But do you think that adding of water, is that having, is it more that it's just allowing certain things to come through, or is that it's starting a process that allows some of that character to come out?
Well, I think it's both. And also I would say that, what we've done is we've adjusted the strength slightly because I think it'll show better in bottle, but it still leaves a lot of room. 57.1 is a great strength because it's still, very high really. And it leaves a lot of room for the drinker to play around further and find their own preferences. It's just finding a balance. It's finding a balance between that and, like I would not have put this cask out at one of the other strengths I use quite commonly, which is 48.5. That's a lot of reduction. And I don't think it would have, in fact, I know because I tested it, it wouldn't have shown that well at that strength. So it's really just about doing a little bit of adjustment that provides balance. It provides a whiskey which is showing a bit more openly once you pour it, a bit more expressively, still leaves room for the drinker to play around with it a lot, still retains the power of the whiskey, and it's allowing us to be able to, say, we've made a few tweaks, we've done some decision making here, and for good reason. And that's always the case, and there might be some whiskies where we reduce quite a lot. We reduce some of our rums quite significantly, and there's always good reason for that. And we'll always tell people when we've done it and why we've done it. Other bottlers are doing it as well. I don't think there's many other bottlers that do it quite as sort of vocally or as regularly as we do, perhaps. But I know that a lot of other bottlers are doing targeted reduction. What I don't like is when bottlers are doing it and just not talking about it, even though it's very obvious that they've put something out at like a sort of weirdly reduced strength. And, sometimes it's fine to do that. I mean, if you've got a reason for doing it, which is commercial or which is just for sake of ease of bottling, like we need to know the strength so we can print the labels, it's sometimes as simple as that, to do with operational and like logistical aspects. But you can tell there's some bottlers that do it quite a lot and, just pretend it's cask strength, like, 51.3 when it was probably like 62%, and they were just trying to get more bottles. So that practice is a little sneaky. And it's not quality focused, that practice, but our practice, our reasoning is always driven by quality and driven by trying to put out what I think of as an interesting product and a quality product.
I've had a question, both direct and also it's in the chat. And it's the same question, people wondering if at your new distillery, if you're going to do a Little Mill style run as part of, and I realize that this is probably getting so far ahead of everything, but is that something that you guys have considered?
Well, it's a good question. So first of all, I don't know, because there's a lot to be figured out about exactly what the character of our whiskey is going to be. But I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, in the very broad brushstroke sense, that we want to create fruit character. And when I talk about fruit, I'm not talking about the fruit that modern whiskey marketeers say. The people who do the marketing for Ardbeg talk about, oh, there's luscious fruit. Ardbeg's not a fruity whiskey. What fucking pish, honestly. Like, fruit in whiskey, true fruit, doesn't exist anymore. It exists in the 60s and early 70s. After that, it's largely lost. True fruit stops you in your tracks and makes you scratch your head and have a sit down and go, what the fuck did I just experience? Proper, fat, fleshy, gorgeous tropical fruits, ripe fruits. This kind of characteristic is so rare in whiskey now. I think you get it a little bit in some Ben Nevis. You get it to some extent a little bit in some Springbanks, but you don't really find it that much. You don't find it anything like the excessiveness, the kind of like embarrassing richness that you found in things like Old Longmorns, Old Bamores, Old Lafroigs. That's what we want to make. Glenougie, yes, Glenougie,
Yeah.
perfect example. That's what we want to make. Little Mill did have some of that. It had a kind of slightly narrow, exotic green combo fruitiness. And so the answer is yes, if you're talking about wanting to make fruit. But the answer is also no, because we're going to have stills which are pretty small by comparison and pretty squat and fat. And our stills are essentially designed to make very heavy spirit. So I think we'll produce something way heavier than Little Mill. I mean, we're going to have a wood-fired 8,000 litre wash still, which is essentially a rip-off of Lafroig's wash still. So, and it's going to go up a slightly sloping line arm into a worm tub. So there's no chance we're going to produce anything as like light and trebly and delicate as Little Mill. We're going to produce a fatberg, basically.
Cool. All right. We need to finish on this whiskey. Harmony's off for a moment, but Kurt, what are your thoughts on the Rhosdhu here? I know you put some notes into the chat, what seems like forever ago.
Yeah, I'll stick to those. Andrew, I know you've been drumming this one for a long time. You were keen on the old Cooper's Choice and stuff we got too. It's a distillate that doesn't have the romance, I think, just because it's not a distillery or anything. So it's been kind of one of those ones we have to really bulk people's towards. But there's some beautiful old ones we've had. This is right in my wheelhouse as well. Cool.
Yeah. Kurt, to your point, there's been times where we literally have to tell people to buy it.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, I don't want it. And like, you do. You just need to try it. But
we've been lucky to have like huge quantities of some of it too, like the Cooper stuff. But at the end, it was like putting it on crazy discounts. So there are some people that walk away with great whiskeys for great prices.
Well, I mean, it's the craziness on two levels. One, it's an independent bottling, so there's always that element of people that didn't want it because it's not an OB, which is idiotic. And then because it's not a distillery, it's like, well, what exactly is it? And anyway, it's there for the people who are going to love it.
Loch Lomond, I think, is probably one of the last properly underrated distilleries, and it had a terrible reputation for a reason for a while, but that's because it had owners that tended to bottle, without any real, I think, quality control or oversight. But a lot of the stuff that's been coming out in recent years has really given the lie to that and started to show it in a new light. I think there's, it's probably one of the last strongholds of, better priced, really good quality whiskey and really charismatic, interesting whiskey. It's just one of those things you need to look for a bit and sift through, but that's what the indies are really good at. Like, so I would say one of the things we just bottled recently is a Croft and Gia Whisky Sponge Edition 77 was a 2007 refill hoggy of Croft and Gia, which is another double distilled Loch Lomond malt, but this time like medium to heavy peated. Super beautiful. Really gorgeous, crisp, pure peat smoke with like a really surprising hit of elegant exotic fruit on the palate. Kind of like a modern Bamore in some ways, but with a profile all its own. So I would, and fairly priced, I think. So that's something, if you guys are getting it in, I would recommend, cracking a bottle or something at some point and trying it, because it's really, really, I think, one of our like hidden gems in the last few months.
Obviously, we're getting.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I assumed you were.
I love Croft and Gia, actually.
So should we talk about the next dram, which is going to be the Ardmore 2000?
Yeah. Let's do it now, Angus. I love the label on this one, and I think you're going to have to give us a few more details on this because it raises a lot of questions.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a few in jokes, but also the general theme is Mad Max. And I tend to think of Aberdeenshire in Scotland, where Ardmore is located, as being kind of like Scotland's Mad Max territory. It's basically just like wild, angry, armed farmers luring people off the beaten track and feeding them to their like savage hounds and stuff. And
probably pigs. Pigs are very good at getting rid of bodies. So
yeah, so
I've
with
heard.
this, I thought, and because Ardmore is very farmy. Ardmore's in Aberdeenshire. It's very farmy whiskey, and it's very sort of gungy, fatty whiskey. So I thought, let's have a Mad Max Aberdeenshire vibe. But beyond that, I also put my friends Ewan and Ashley on the label. Ewan is the head of casks, basically, at Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And he and I have a joke about Ardmore, and I don't know where this came from. It was something to do, because I do some work for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. I do the tasting panel. I'm one of the chairs of the tasting panel. So I write some of the silly notes and things that they do. And I know Ewan very well. We're very good friends. And we have this in-joke about crabs and Ardmore, and how, I don't know where it came from. Something like a tasting note one day for Ardmore came up with a lot of crab references. And from there, it's just one of these stupid jokes that stuck. So that it's partly an explainable joke and partly an inexplicable joke. So that was the reasoning behind this really zany, weird label. And then the whiskey itself is actually, I think it's really a quite sexy dram. So first of all, it's not the Ardmore that a lot of people are used to these days, which is young, ex-Lefroy cask Ardmore. This is classic Ardmore from year 2000, and that's when they were still direct coal firing the stills. So really a sort of proper traditional Highland malt. It was still when it was at its original peating level. So I would say around about somewhere between Springbank and Talisker, sort of light to medium level peat. And that combination really created what I consider the classic Ardmore distillery character, which is quite heavy, quite fat, quite thick in texture, and a bit oily, a bit sort of coal smoke, greasy coal smoke, but with a nice background herbal peat characteristic. And that is exactly what sits at the core of this bottling. However, it was double matured for just over 2 years in first fill Oloroso sherry casks, which is obviously where the color comes from. And you've got this extra layer in there now with that sherry characteristic. And I think the crucial thing here is that the double maturation period was just over 2 years. So it is a proper double maturation. It's not just a finish. It's not a flash finishing. It's had time for the sherry to integrate, to really give a proper influence on the Ardmore spirit, and for them to knit together. So I think you do get a really interesting take on Ardmore. I think you get an interestingly sherry and peat fusion whiskey, and I think that you definitely get a really nice dram as a result of it. I love the sort of, I get something new from this whiskey every time I go back to it. I love the subtle peat. I love the kind of more bitter chocolate, herbal, walnutty, slightly salty aspects from the sherry, the gamey notes, the meaty notes. And I love the more traditional Ardmore aspects, which are in there, like that kind of coal smoke thing, the slightly herbal qualities. I find all of these characteristics in there. And I think the age is nice. 22 years, it's a good, mature, rounded age. It's cask strength. So again, it's not one we've done any kind of real intervention on anything. It's just as it's come from the cask. And yeah, I think you don't really find sherried Ardmores these days. So it's a nice chance to try that spirit in the very classical sense, with a nice, clean, but rigorous sherry influence in there.
Yeah. Angus, it's funny you should say that, because I really struggle with Ardmore, and I know Kurt does too. Our colleague Evan's not here. I know Evan is more apologetic and more sympathetic to Ardmore, but I find a lot of it is just too barnyardy and not in the best way. And it's interesting you talk about this, because for probably the last decade, the best Ardmores I've had have all been sherry cask Gordon MacPhail bottlings of Ardmore. And this is kind of going in that direction. like it's the right balance of sherry. It's not over the top. It's not too light. The peat in there, the peat level in there is nice too. And yeah, it's just there's lots of complexity to it. So this is a pleasant surprise for me because I really struggle with Ardmore.
It's
Yeah,
funny. I hear a lot of people talking about struggling with Ardmore. I do get it. I've always loved it. I always thought Ardmore was a really, charismatic, interesting distillate that had a really interesting story about its production and really interesting history. And I've had many great examples over the years, and I just always thought it was a bit bewildering to me why it was not better loved. But I do get it. It's another one of those whiskies which is still, just not as widely enjoyed as, like you used to have other names from mainland Scotland which were totally under the radar that no one gave a shit about, like Benriach. No one used to care about Benriach, and that's all changed. Glendronach, same, all changed. And Ardmore is one of the last ones which has still got a bit of way to go, I would say. But it's interesting too you say that, and I agree about the G&M and the sherry aspect. I think Ardmore loves sherry, but it needs to be done carefully. I think G&M do a generally very good job. I like their bottlings of Ardmore a lot.
I think, and I mean, I'm coming from a background of, I used to be a huge Bowmore fan back in the Morrison Bowmore days when the company was getting the respect it was due. And I kind of feel under Beam Suntory, that's not been the case. But what's funny to me in all of this is that I know the Bowmore guys feel like they're not being looked after properly or given the amount of time and attention they're due. But if they're not, the Ardmore guys are completely forgotten. And I think there's an element of a lot of what gets filled at Ardmore is, if it's an active ex-Lefroy cask, then, it might do okay at a young age. But I think a lot of what's been put into barrel just does not seem to mature well. And I've had a lot of very lackluster Ardmore, probably more so than a lot of distilleries.
I think the problem with these Ardmores is that they are the ones you reference that are being put into ex-Lefroy casks is that they just get completely wiped out by the Lefroy influence. Like Lefroy's such a beast, it just flattens out the. I think those whiskies are interesting whiskies and that they're often decent, but they stray too often into being like generic peat flavor whiskey for me, which I think is a shame. I think you lose the sort of integrity of the Ardmore character, which is a shame. Yeah, but yeah, I agree. It's a distillery which is kind of just like blending fodder, slightly unloved, and certainly when you're a big company and you've got Bowmore and Lefroy to deal with, obviously Ardmore is going to end up taking a back seat. Yeah. But yeah, that's a shame for sure.
Harmony, what are your thoughts on this one?
I like it. I mean, I like Ardmore. I like its kind of farmy style. I don't know. I dig it. I like its profile. I like the deep fruits. Jeff said cola. It's definitely in there for me as well. Kind of syrupy, meaty, chewy, a little farmy. Yeah, I dig it. Nice. And it's changed a little bit too from when I first nosed it to now. So it's definitely one that you can enjoy over time. And I don't feel like it has quite the complexity as the old Rhosdhu. Like that's really cool. And I put some water in it and it's in the last 15 minutes changed a ton. Maybe I'll add water to this, see what happens. But yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Thanks, Harmony. Kurt?
Yeah, my favorite distillery, Andrew, that farminess is something I absolutely hunt out. Ardmore's just never struck it for me, but I also think that's because of what we've been exposed to in our market up until the last few years. In the last few years, I've probably had more Ardmores that I liked than didn't like, but for an awful long time, what we were getting here was really slim pickings. I remember when it was like, the only thing we could get our hands on was traditional or whatever it was, and then it was replaced by legacy. Just rubbish young bottlings that weren't exciting at all. So there's been some really cool ones. This to me has almost like an Isle of Peat sort of thing going on with it. Very soupy, very bouillon-y, a little bit winey on the back end of the palate for my liking, but it's all right. I actually like this. This is an Ardmore I would buy and I would drink for sure.
Agreed. This is what I would like Ardmore to be. And Angus, your comment about sherry is an interesting one, because outside of Gordon MacPhail, we don't see Ardmore and sherry, and maybe that's part of the problem.
Probably. I think you might start to see more of it in sherry, because I think a lot more indie bottlers that have been able to do some kind of re-racking programs have put a lot of these, like 09 to 2013 refill Lefroy barrel Ardmores into sherry to try and differentiate them. So that sort of thing will probably start to feed through to the market in the next, 2 to 3 years. But the diversity, the quality, I don't know, we'll see. SMWS have done some interesting sherry stuff as well, but yeah, they're like, it's all single casks, so it goes under the radar quite a bit. So yeah, if we move on to the notable age statement bottling.
Yeah.
So obviously we do Sponge, we do a series called Equinox and Solstice as well, but this is the most recent brand that we launched. It's called Notable Age Statements, NAS. And it was really just me thinking, right, well, I'd like to do a series which could house multiple spirits. And how do we do that? What's the approach? What should we do? And I thought the universal like unifying theme is time. So the time taken to produce, the time taken in cask, all these things. So I thought, well, everyone associates NAS with non-age statement. Maybe there's something in that. Oh yeah, notable age statement. Let's just call it that. So that was really just it. It's like just a very obvious joke that becomes slightly less funny every time you hear it. But that was the thought process behind it. And as I say, this is a series which is really designed to celebrate and kind of uphold the whole important role that time plays in sculpting the spirits that we love. So that's any spirits which are aged, rums, armagnacs, cognacs. We've done whiskey, rum, and armagnac so far in this series, and I'm still waiting to sort out a cognac. That'll happen sooner or later, I'm sure. But for now, this was the first edition we did of Notable Age Statements, which was a 30-year-old blended malt. And this is a cask of whiskey from Signatory. So this was something that Signatory sort of put together. Essentially, it's a mix of cask samples and the tail ends of bottlings and all sorts of leftovers that Signatory collected between 1997 and 2007. So if you look at what Signatory was bottling in that time, there's tons and tons of stuff from the 60s, from even some stuff from the 50s, loads of stuff from the 70s, loads of closed distilleries, loads of incredible whiskies, essentially. So there's probably hundreds of these things all mixed together in this vat. And the rule they adhered to when they created this mix was it has to be minimum 16 years old. Well, actually, I think that's what just the youngest component was once they'd done it. It was minimum 16 years old, but with many, many older components in there. So this is in 2007, minimum 16 years old, and they put the mix into 3 first fill sherry butts to mature further. And they sat for quite a while, and we bottled the first one as Whisky Sponge Edition 18, and then there's this one, which is the NAS Edition 1, 30-year-old. And by this point, it was, I think actually when this was bottled, it was technically 31 years old, but 30 was a nicer number, so went with that. But yeah, 30 minimum age, but there's obviously many components in there that are way, way older and have spent a lot longer in cask marrying. And I think the key thing about this for me is that it's just a lovely old style profile. It's sherry forward, obviously it's sherry dominated. The sherry cask got a big role to play, but there's so many flavor components in here coming from the fact that there's many old style whiskies in this. There's many, many old school distillates, lots of closed distilleries, really waxy, fatty, old school Klein Leachy style flavor profiles in there. Lots of nice old style peat roll as well. So the fusion of all these things together, and the fact it's sat in cask for another 13 years, marrying and fusing together, creates a very cohesive profile. So I love this whiskey. I'm really, really happy with it. I was very happy we got to bottle it. It's just a single cask at cask strength, 560 bottles or so. And yeah, I just think it's, you know, if you want to explore kind of or get a taste of what old school sherry malt whiskey used to taste like, this is pretty close in my view.
I want to start off by saying kudos to you for seeing the opportunity to create a line extension called NAS that no one else had seen before. So when I saw that for the first time, I thought that was really clever. Doug, who's here with me, is wondering, and I think Kurt's comment sort of echoes this in a different lineup. Doug's asking how much 1980s Bowmore is in this, because the lavender to him is like off the charts.
So I've had this conversation as well. Like, I'm usually quite sensitive to soap and lavender and stuff like that. To me, I don't think it's that excessive. I don't think there's much 80s Bowmore in this. I think there's probably who knows what's in there. I think sometimes when you mix a lot of whiskies together that you do sometimes get that character, but I don't actually think it's that excessive. I mean, I don't know. I totally get that some people, if you're sensitive to that, might find that note in this, but it's, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a very personal threshold kind of situation.
I don't get it. And I'm one of those people that can tolerate a certain amount of that lavender in Bowmore of that certain era. But for me, I love the idea behind this, because it's surprising to me that more independent bottlers have not done something like this previously. The only other comparable I can think of is the society at the vaults used to have the living cask on their bar, where they kept dumping things into it over time. It's an interesting concept, because it's an unrepeatable, changing, sort of living one-off thing that I wish more companies had thought of doing, because I just think it's cool. I mean, it's unintentional blending. Like, you're not blending with any skill or intent. It's just putting it in a vat and seeing what happens.
Yeah, and when you do that, you tend to get mush in the first instance. You tend to get this just sort of mash of malt whiskey flavor, sort of quite generic profile, and it needs time and cask to kind of re-single and reform and reconstitute into something specific and something distinctive. I mean, I'm doing it myself. Like, I've got an old refill sherry butt in my garage, which I've been slowly filling since 2016 with all the leftovers of everything I do in whiskey. Like, I get so many samples, so many cask samples, and I'm never going to finish them all. So I've just been slowly filling this refill sherry butt, and one day, I don't know, one day it'll get full enough that I'll just hammer the bung in and leave it for a few years and let it kind of re-single, and then probably bottle it privately as something. I don't know. It's just an experiment, like you say. So it'd be interesting to see how it evolves.
I've got my 8-year sherry seasoned Tomatin cask here that does the same thing. The challenge is, in our market, it's so dry here that, like, I have to keep topping it up constantly, just to keep it going. I can't imagine. I mean, my wife never goes in the garage. I'm pretty sure I could hide a 500-liter cask in there somewhere. So
I'd recommend it.
Yeah, that'll be the next project. I'll have to figure that out.
Warehouse, man. You have a warehouse.
Yeah,
That's right. I have a warehouse. I could
just put in your garage. If
So,
you use your garage ender, you have the excuse of you go out and just spray it with some water, keep it from
gotta
drying
keep the
out.
wood damp. Yeah, no, this is a cool product. I didn't allow myself to purchase one of these. I kind of wish I had, but there's always going to be something else in the pipeline. Kurt, why don't I start with you this time? What are your thoughts on the palate?
So a palate,
Or just the whiskey in general, just in general.
Yeah. As a whole, man, what a nose. It's so old school. Did you ever get to try that Samaroli Evolution? It's sort of the same deal, where there's a whole schwackload of old stuff. Old like 50 Springbanks and Ardbags and all kinds of crazy shit in there. Kind of reminds me a little bit of that. And that was a banger of a bottle too. I love this. And that slight soapiness that I don't get on the nose at all, but I do get it on the palate. It's actually more like a oil of Olay or something, like a
Hand cream or something
vanilla
like that.
almond hand cream or something.
Sorry?
It's like a vanilla almond hand cream or something on the palate to me, just slightly.
Okay, Harmony, thoughts?
Yeah, this is big. This is a lot of things happening. Yeah, I put down like a little bit soapy on the palate. It's, to me, there's something floral in there that I can't quite place. Maybe even lilacs over lavender, but there's quite a bit for me of minerality, and like I said, like pencil shavings really jumped out at me. But it kind of reminds me, takes me to this bed and breakfast I used to, like, my grandparents rebuilt from the 1930s, and the family that built it, their daughter was in her late 80s when I met her, but she donated a lot of old furniture that she had kept from when she lived there. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of like opening up those drawers of the dressers and those old wardrobes, like that old wood smell. It's
I
great.
totally get what you mean. Yeah, yeah, I get that. It's a nice description.
Yeah.
It definitely smells old, that's for sure. It was a good one to do for as a first bottling for a series about time, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree 100%. I tried when you poured to me this stuff in Rotterdam, I was just blown away because it's actually reminded me of all those old whiskeys that we just talk about.
Mhm.
You know, those closed distilleries. Who knows what? And actually, I don't care because it's just a good whiskey that reminded me of the good old days. It's really my kind of thought about this whiskey.
Mhm. So on that note, we should probably keep this going because I am sensitive to the time here for Angus. We've got a Springbank to talk about, which is not something that gets poured that often in tastings anymore, which is sad. This is sold out, unfortunately, but we made sure to make sure that we kept one bottle back for the purpose of tasting, because that way 40 people get to try it rather than one person putting it on their bar. So Angus, what can you tell us about this 1994 27-year-old Springbank?
It's a 1994 27-year-old Springbank. Yes. So now this is one of two casks we purchased from a private cask owner, really. And that's where everyone gets their casks of Springbank from these days. It's all private cask owners, private individuals. So same with the one we just bottled recently. So this is, we were lucky, we're just lucky, good contacts. We work hard to develop these contacts and find a deal that works for them. And, it's luck of the draw. You either work with someone who's a really nice person and wants to do a nice project and gets it and is fair, or with someone who thinks they've got the crown jewels and wants every goddamn penny they can get for it. This guy was sort of a bit of a mishmash, halfway house between the two, but we managed to do a deal, got two casks, and so I thought let's do them together as a nice pair and do them in a very kind of minimalist theme, old sort of typewriter style lettering on the labels, and just keep it really plain and focused on the contents of the bottle. So this was the first of the pair. It was a 1994 refill sherry hogshead, even though the sherry character is very minimalistic. It's really more just a refill hoggy, and it's nice in the sense that the natural strength is down at 47%, so it's very elegant. It's still a lot of Springbank distillery character, but with quite a bit of age. So it's soft, it's supple, it's elegant. It's got some lovely sort of intricate fruit characteristics, but still lots of these very classical, I think, like Springbank DNA notes, which to me is like very wispy, gentle peat, very coastal, very fresh, soft waxiness, like citrus waxy combinations. These are all to me very trademark Springbank distillery characteristics. So this one, and then a 1995 just standard refill hogshead, which had a bit more power. That was like 51.2 or something like that, I think. And that was more classical even still, in the sense that it was just very direct Springbank DNA bottling. But I think this one had a little bit more kind of leatheriness, originating probably from this refill sherry influence, a slightly different take. And, you know, they totally split the crowd, these two. Whenever people have tried them, there's some people preferred the 95, some people prefer this one. And obviously, whichever tasting I'm doing with every bottle, that's always my favorite at the time. So this is my favorite of the two. But it's they're both beautiful whiskies. We're lucky to get these bottlings, and I'm very pleased that you guys have opened one. I think that's super cool. So I hope you enjoy it. You know, it's true what Andrew says. It's not every day that you get to try Springbank of this age anymore. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to talk about it and for you guys to taste it. So I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, Angus, before we get to that, can you talk about, what's the rationale behind your design on the label on this one? Because it's not as kind of loud as a lot of the other ones that you guys have.
I just wanted to leave no room to hide. Like, it, you know, the point is, I suppose, so first of all, when you bottle a Springbank, you can do anything. You can make it jazzy and loud, or you can make it super minimalistic, because it'll still sell. So it gives you a little bit more freedom to do whatever it is you actually want to do. And what I wanted to do for a while was do something quite simple and plain like this, which is actually inspired by a bottle of Glenlivet 1883, 50 years old, bottled in the 1930s, which is in a super rare bottle. A parcel of them showed up at auction, I don't know, like 10 years ago, and all got bought by people like Sukhinder and Bagnoni. And I remember seeing pictures of these bottles when they came out for auction, just thinking, fuck me, these are beautiful bottles, incredible, literal time warp stuff. And they were just typewriter written labels. They've just been typed out on an old school typewriter. And I just loved that. I thought it's just so cool. So ever since then, I thought, in my back of my mind, I thought, I'd do a label based on that. So this was my attempt to do a label with a little bit of that inspiration behind it, but still keep it a little bit spongy. So the humor in this and you know, any kind of sort of more subversive aspects, it's all in the writing. You need to read the label in detail. You need to read the rear label. That's where all the kind of jokes, for want of a better word, are. Not so much on the front label, but definitely on the back label. The front label is really just meant to be riffing on old style typewritten, hand typed labels. So question from Adam, do you design the bottle personally? So yes, in the sense that I come up with the concepts for every design, every artwork, every label. And what I do is I type them out to my artist in great detail and say, this is exactly what I want. He sketches it or she sketches it. We work with two artists, and from those sketches, I comment and say, okay, change that, tweak that, whatever. And then we move to a final copy, final art design. So it's a collaborative process, but the concepts and the ideas and certainly the writing is all mine.
The nose on this is good. The palate is gorgeous. It's so buttery. It's so fatty. Yeah, I love it. Harmony, I think it's your turn to get to go first this time with some thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. It's big. It's pretty. It's full. I totally agree with Jeff. Like if there were smokers in the room at the time this was made, like there's some smoke on it, in appearance, but it's a pretty lush whiskey. I'm happy to have enjoyed two older Springbanks with you guys in the last two Spongeworthy tastings, because nowadays even the 10 is hard to find. So
right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kurt?
Super cool. It's like Springbank from a distance. It's like, to me, it's really faint. It doesn't scream Springbank to you, but you can absolutely tell what it is. Palate for me absolutely explodes into that old Springbank territory. Do you remember that clear fronted, clear windowed 25 year from years back, Andrew, red label?
Oh, in the terrible box.
Yeah. It reminds me of that and the old 32, those two distillery bottlings around.
Because wasn't that 25 also supposed to be 32 years of age, but they bottled it as 25?
I'd heard something to that effect, but I don't know. But I do know there was a lot of extra years in some of those. The 2005 21 was a thing or two. But yeah, I love the old paper, shale and clay. There's like grilled whitefish, pepper, and that brininess and stuff. That really, really coastal edge.
And this one is a decade away from that 1969 signatory Springbank that just went so tropical.
That was amazing.
Which was a gorgeous bottling. Yeah, there's not a lot to say about this. I know, Angus, you're a little younger than Kurt and I, but like 96, Kurt and I both finished high school that year. So the year has a significance to me. But also back before the world had discovered Springbank, I had the privilege to bottle 2 different sherry butts of 96 Springbank for our shop. The first was a Oloroso, the second was a Manzanilla, and they were just gorgeous, gorgeous bottlings. And I remember at the time, customers saying like, why is this so exciting? It's like, dude, this is a single cask of like good sherried Springbank. Like this is, you need to have this. And the first cask actually took us, it was hard to sell. And nowadays, like just think what those would go for in 10 minutes on the secondary market. It's stupid.
Yeah.
But that's partly why for me, like even if we get just 6 bottles of something like this, I want to open it because I want to know that at least one of those 6 bottles that went through our shop got open and enjoyed by people and created a sense of community, and I don't know what else from it, but.
And
finished one of those 96s not long ago, those KWM ones.
Yeah.
I had both of them, got one left.
And guys, it's actually interesting detail about this whiskey, because it's actually came to Canada accidentally, almost. Yes, because it was kind of deal that we made with Angus, because it was a little bit before it's a first bottling. So the first bottling actually came after the second one. And that's because, somebody lucky, we're really lucky that somebody actually didn't get their shipment. And that shipment was actually came to Canada, which I'm very happy about.
Yeah, so am I. That's nice that it's a nice that a bottle ends up getting open and everyone gets to try it. That's cool. Yeah,
along with others, actually, with Ben Nevis and lots of others.
Yeah,
so I'm very happy about it.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad it ended up in the hands of good people. Yeah, no, these Springbank bottlings, they are special, and we're very lucky to have been able to do them. And we've just done another one. The problem now is, of course, that they're expensive, and private cask owners want top dollar. Essentially, they want top dollar price per bottle to to let go a cask like this. So that's why the price is just jumping up almost by the month whenever you can get stocks of these. But they are beautiful whiskies, and as long as industrious people can do things like this and put on tastings like this, then hopefully we'll all still occasionally get to try these nice things. So yeah, that's cool.
Well, just to quickly diffuse a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat or comments before we move on to the last whiskey, and then we'll start winding this down. I know this comes up a lot, and people want to know why is Springbank so hard to get, and it's because, for better or worse, they're producing less than half or a third of what distilleries like Kilchoman are producing, and there's not enough of it out there. They've slowly increased production over the last 5 years or so, but it's not even going to make a difference 10-15 years from now. The trajectory for a distillery like this is that there's never going to be enough of it, at least in the foreseeable future. So if you get it, the 10, I think, is probably the best, most consistent one out there, but even those are hard to come by now. Angus, we got one last one, the Lechig, then we're going to do a vote, and then we're going to work towards cutting you loose, because you've been a very good sport in this, and I know that we've got a crowd here that's got lots of questions and wants to know as much as they can. But
I'm always happy to answer questions. That's all right. But yeah, let's talk about the Ledaig before we get to that. So, last jam of the night is Whisky Sponge edition number 70, and with every 10th edition of Sponge, I like to try and bottle something or put out something special or different, or just a whiskey that I think is really great. And this is absolutely that latter category for me. So I love Ledaig. I've always liked Ledaig, and I like whiskey and peat when they, so sherry and peat when they tango well together. And this was, to me, a perfect example of something that really worked. So this is two second fill sherry butts of Ledaig. They were both really low in content. There's only around 312 bottles of this that came out of 2 butts combined together. So they'd really had a very concentrative maturation in a kind of warmer, drier warehouse. And, natural cask strength ended up being 62.1%. And the fusion of those 2 butts together created something really special, like an incredibly intense, hugely peaty, very sherried, very meaty, very tarry powerhouse Ledaig, and one that really reminded me of like a lot of the 70s Ledaigs with that kind of like level of peat, level of intensity. So I was just struck straight away by the power of these. They're, again, it's one of these whiskies which you could sort of argue is maybe a bit divisive because it's so really gamey, leathery, tarry, meaty. It's quite an aggressive style of sherry, and it's only second fill. And I think what's happened is that very concentrated maturation has kind of soaked every last element of activity and sherry out of those casks and created a very kind of cooked, syrupy style. But it's a style I really like, and I just was very happy that we managed to do this kind of small batch combination thing. And again, it speaks to this thing that we try to do with Decadent Drinks, which is put out products which wouldn't otherwise exist. These 2 would have been bottled as 2 single casks separately, and they're both quite different. One was up at, I think, 67%, the other one was down at 60, and the 67% one had very few bottles in it. And so the mix of the 2 really balanced everything out and created the best of both worlds. So anyway, I'm curious to see what people think of that, because I think this is, I think it's one of the sort of like most crazy things we've done recently, and I love it.
Mm-hmm. All right, Kurt, I think it's your time to go first, which I know is not entirely fair because, like me, you are not always a Lechig guy or Ledaig.
Yeah, cool range today. Ardmore and Lechig in a tasting that I like both of them. That's really, really crazy to me. This is one of the most challenging distillates, I would argue. I like a lot of the old school challenging pukey ones, farmy ones, everything, but this one has always just been a little dirtier than I can really wrap my head around. The palate I like despite that dirtiness. The nose here though is just an absolute cracker. Really cool whiskey.
Cool. Harmony?
I do not have a problem with Lechig. I love it. It's always bold and weird and delicious. This is definitely a little bit more of a approachable style. Love the smoke, love the dark kind of plummy notes, the dried fruit, definitely chewy leather, and oddly enough, this is the weirdest tasting note. My neighbor years ago used to play the accordion, and he would come over for a dram. Often he would show up with his hands full of little glasses of vodka with his accordion box on his arm. And the first note of that is him opening up that accordion box. And he would drink vodka and then he'd play, and then I'd switch to scotch. And that's kind of what it reminded me of, is those
Harmony, I don't know why, but I thought when you introduced that note that this is going to be the weirdest note ever, I thought you were going to go in like a totally different direction. So that's really cool. Like that kind of bringing in a memory, and that's amazing. For me, this note in Lechig, and I get it in Lechig and nothing else. And Angus, this note's going to mean nothing to you in the UK, but hockey rooms in Canada have this type of rubber flooring, especially dressing rooms in like the 90s and the 80s, like these old ones that were kind of rubber, but they were like this harder substance. And like cold, wet skates would go on it all the time. And you'd get these little shavings of it off. And for me, Lechig always has that, whether when it's good and I like it, or when it's undrinkable and I don't, which I do believe personally is a character of Lechig. But yeah, it's such an interesting whiskey. This to me is without question the most polarizing whiskey out there, because even more so than Laphroaig, like people will love it or hate it, but they'll love it or hate it almost based on each bottling, not the distillery as a whole, because it's incredibly inconsistent.
That is a great tasting note, Andrew. The hockey, yeah.
I thought you meant the incredibly inconsistent. I was like, yeah, great note for the
Stop it, Kurt.
Well, it's the opposite of Dave Broom with Kalila, right? It's like the least consistently good, to me at least, distillery out there. Like it's the opposite of that. And I know there's always room for disagreement. Harmony and Evan, who's not on the tasting tonight, they both love Lechig, but for me, it's so hit and miss. But when it's good, it can be incredible. And this is another great bottling of it.
It's true. It does well, it does have a bit of an inconsistency about it at times, but that's part of the excitement. Sometimes I think is, hoping you're going to get something good, and when you do, when it's really good, it's special.
Now, Angus, I've got a couple of questions here for you, and we do want to wind this down soon because I don't want to keep you here too long tonight. One of the questions is a great one, and it's kind of a complicated one. It comes from Devin, who's here with me, and it's about sulfur, because sulfur is something that comes up in whiskey quite often. You both, as like a whiskey reviewer and critic, are going to come across it from time to time, but also as in your capacity as an independent bottler, you're going to come across casks that are sulfured, maybe some of them more than others. We're just kind of interested in some insight from you on it, because there's a lot of people who, for whom sulfur is just black and white. It's always wrong, or they always love it no matter how much is there. I guess I'd just like to hear a little bit from you on this, because it's a reality that's out there with a certain amount of whiskey.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think it's not as bad as it used to be. There used to be some pretty atrocious sherry casks, which were like, they literally burnt sulfur candles in them or something to try and purify them for shipping, which is obviously not a good way to start. I make a distinction between things like spirit sulfur and cask sulfur. Cask sulfur, I think, is something that's rarely good, but I find it less and less these days. Spirit sulfur is something where I think you've got a reaction between, and you can find spirit sulfur aspects in, like, like I'm pretty sure that Ben Nevis we had earlier, the 1996, would have had some spirit sulfur in it. I think Ben Nevis has a lot of spirit sulfur in it. And that can create things like waxiness, greasiness, oiliness. It can create some characteristics which in balance are very positive and desirable and sometimes beautiful in whiskey. In the same way that in combination with sherry, they can create what I would determine as this type of whiskey the Lechig has, which is what I call a natural dirtiness, which is something which goes more towards earth. And someone mentioned leaf mulch there. I get that very commonly in these sorts of whiskies. And, like damp, mulchy wine cellars and very heavy tobacco, and game meats. Game meats and rancio are really, to me, strong signifiers of like natural dirtiness, spirit sulfur combining with sherry to create these kind of characteristics. That to me is something I quite like, but it is a divisive profile. And some people, like I'm quite sensitive to soap. Some people are very sensitive to sulfur. different palates, different people have different sensitivities and different preferences. But sulfur is a complicated thing, and it's not necessarily always a bad thing in whiskey. Most things in excess either create off notes or they create hyper simplicity. In the same way that I think Octomore is less interesting than Port Charlotte because it's a less complex whiskey. You know, it's going more heavily in one mono direction. And in the same way that, you know, something that goes towards just total sherry bomb territory, even if it's hyper clean, it's still hyper boring if it's just tasting like very thick, heavy sherry. So, you know, it's like all things. You want balance and complexity, and you want a degree of harmony in your you know, whiskey in your flavor. Sorry, harmony, yes. You want a degree of balance and equilibrium in the between all the different flavor forces in your dram. I do think you get those occasional whiskeys where you get sulfur, which to me is just pure bad sulfur. And sometimes it's the cask, sometimes it's the spirit and the cask together. But it's predominantly the cask, I think. And that's when you're getting flavors which are like drains, cabbage, socks, farts, that kind of like really atrocious level of, you know, really sulfuric, like you've just walked into the gates of Hades kind of aroma and flavor. That is bad. And thankfully, I don't find that very often. That's something that I think has been largely consigned to the dustbin of history. Although you do get occasional stuff, but I did make a strong distinction between that and spirit sulfur and natural dirtiness and those kind of characteristics, which I think are a little more nuanced, more complex, and perhaps less well understood.
Yeah, I mean, like there's distilleries that are trying to emphasize that character style and have done so for historic reasons. But when it's a flaw, I mean, that's a little bit less difficult to delineate. So I appreciate that answer. I've got another question here from guys, but before I get to it, I just want to comment on a note. Angus, I don't know if you caught it in there, but Jeff commented on cooking bear meat smells good. This is probably something you don't hear or ever see very often.
I know that you guys hunt bear. That's all.
I mean, we don't all hunt bear, but there are at times an abundance of bears. I have eaten bear meat once. I personally don't like it. And I am not.
I'm curious. I would definitely try some bear meat if I come visit. You know, like I mean, I'm presuming that it's predominantly people hunting, and the population is controlled, and it's not like you're off slaughtering rare, you know, endangered species of bear where there's only like 3 left. You know, the lesser spotted rainbow grizzly of the, you know, whatever it is. You know, so I presume that. Yeah, it's fine. And if I came to visit at some point, I would be very happy to taste bear because I've never tried it.
I'm pretty sure
I've heard it's salty. I don't know if that's true or not.
Keep in mind, well, I don't know, for me, the one thing that stuck out to me was just how greasy the meat was. But they tend to eat a lot of berries. So like that's their, especially where I am in Alberta, like that's their primary is like berries. They might eat the odd animal that they stumble upon that's already dead. But yeah, they're a curious animal. They're omnivores. They eat whatever. They're opportunists. They'll eat whatever they can eat. Not going in that direction. Devin here's got a good question for you. The question was about buying bottles at auction, whether that's something you're still doing or if there's too many fakes getting into that now. And I think, Devin, did I get that right? Yeah.
I've always spent way too much money at auction. That's like, I don't know. It's like it's probably a problem. I should probably stop. Especially now that I have like a family and shit. I should really be more responsible. But yeah, I spend way too much money at auction. I pretty much buy predominantly all my whiskey at auction, rather than retail, just because I'm interested in old bottles and I'm a nerd, and I'm always hunting for that like elusive thing, and it's where you can still find real surprises and things that you never saw before, never tried before.
Like this?
And you can, yeah, like whatever that, I'm gonna have to look at the video. What is that? Moidart.
Moiter.
Yeah,
Devin,
I've
what's
I've
this?
tried that before. Yeah, it's good.
This is old Springbank? This is apparently 60s Springbank and Brooklady.
So I'm trying to think of what I bought at auction recently. Because I've got lots of things at auction recently. So yes, the short answer is it's kind of a hobby, just buying nice old bottles at auction and then sticking them on the shelf and thinking, when am I going to open that? And eventually getting around to opening it. And that's my whiskey passion. That's what whiskey is for me, is just stashing some bottles, enjoying owning them for a while, thinking about them occasionally when no one's looking, taking them out and fondling them a bit, and then one day meeting up with friends, cool people, and just crack them open and enjoy them.
So I've
never
really gotten into the auction side of things, but for my almost now 20 years in the industry, I've been setting aside bottles for the future that I intend to drink someday. And now when I look back on it, some of these things I don't know that I'm ever actually going to drink them, but it is a bit of a compulsion that can definitely get away from you. And next thing you know, you're storing it offsite at a warehouse because there's not enough room in your home, or your wife gets angry about it. I mean, these things can happen to the best of us.
I'm very lucky. My partner Lucy's pretty understanding. I don't know how much she really truly knows about my problem, but yeah, she's reasonably understanding. Question there: what do I buy at auction? Old Glen Grant, old 100 proof bottlings, sometimes old blends, old vatted malts, and just anything that I think I have a reasonably good judgment for what's probably good, because I know old bottles pretty well. I know what to look for. So I'm sort of bargain hunting to an extent. And sometimes I'm just like saving a bit of money and buying with a little bit of an eye for business, because I also open bottles for festivals. So when I still do that work, I'm investing a bit more heavily in like nice bottles that I think people will want to taste and drink.
Sure. So Devin's got a follow-up based on that. How prevalent do you think fakes are in that market now?
Pretty prevalent, probably much more so than when I was doing auctioneering. Like you'd have to pay me an astonishing amount of money to go back and work in auctions. I fucking would not thank you for it. I think it wasn't as bad when I was doing it, but now because prices are so high, there's more money in it. There's far more motivation for people to do it. So I think it's become a bigger problem, especially for Macallan. But then I also sort of think that if you're willing to pay the prices of these Macallan bottles, then you kind of deserve to be ripped off. So, I'm less concerned about that aspect of it. What I'm more concerned about is me being ripped off. That's when I start to get annoyed. And someone asked, Harmony, you asked a thing, and have you ever bought a bottle at auction and felt ripped off? Yeah, definitely, because you don't get everything right all the time. I tell you what happened to me recently. It was like one of the most embarrassing moments of my professional career. We did a dinner for our distillery partners, and there was a guy there from Ardmore distillery who is advising us on direct firing and doing direct firing of the stills. So I had what I thought was this beautiful old unlabeled bottle of Teachers from like the 1920s. It said Teacher on the bottom, and the label on the thing said, "Oh, Old Teacher's Blend." It was just like a little fragment of label someone had stuck on. It was a genuine old capsule, genuine old cork. But when I took it out, it was some kind of horrific old weird mint liqueur. I've no idea what happened, how that was wrong, but it was particularly embarrassing because I'd done like a speech for about 5 minutes talking about how special this bottle was to a room full of people, and then opened it and was like, oh shit. So I sort of sat down and just cried internally for about half an hour after that.
My question was basically along the lines of like the fraudulent bottles on the market. It's really depressing that's become a market in itself. I mean, it's always been around, but even as you said, the more popular whiskey gets, the more that becomes its own entity. It's really
the one thing I have, which is that I've got a reasonably good relationship with most of the auction houses, and also because I've got some sort of level of vague credibility with them, that if I lean on them and say, hey, I bought this bottle from you, I'm 100% certain it's not right, I will usually get a refund without too much grief. But that doesn't happen too often. I'm not really bidding on the bottles that people are targeting for fakes. You know, to do that, it's the ones where you're spending 4 figures and above on bottles, where certainly on old bottles where things get more problematic. But yeah, big picture, it's much worse than it was, purely because prices, etc.
All right, Angus, because I want to cut you loose here in a moment. I've launched the poll. Everyone gets a chance to vote for their 2 favorite whiskeys. I am gonna also, my dog's getting a little bit antsy. He's getting which is a problem. Currently,
my dog is crying outside the door right now and has been for 20 minutes.
All right, Angus, I'm going to put you on the spot on this. Knowing what we've sampled tonight, if you had to pick 2 favorite whiskeys from tonight's lineup for no reason other than you just they're whiskeys you'd be happy drinking, which 2 would you walk away with the bottle?
Probably the Lechig and the NAS blended malt. I love the Springbank. I love the old Rhosdhu. I love all of them, but those are the 2 which are kind of special to me, and they're the ones that I would probably take the most like long-term pleasure in.
Okay. Harmony, what are your 2 favorites?
Old Rhosdhu and Lechig for me tonight.
Nice.
Yeah.
Igor, you've probably tried these all at some point. What are your 2 favorites?
I would agree with Angus. Okay, let's get Springbank out of the picture, obviously, but I would say NAS, and I'm probably gonna go to Glen Grant because as I said,
got a reputation to uphold, Igor.
Yes.
Well, you're the unofficial brand ambassador apparently for Glen Grant in Canada, so
Apparently, yes. But I love Glen Grant, so.
Igor, we're gonna get a T-shirt made for you for the next time you're out this way.
You can always spot a true Glen Grant fanatic because they're always going around trying to persuade other people not to buy or drink Glen Grant.
Absolutely.
Really
I'm always
trying to
saying
keep prices down as much as possible.
True.
All right. Kurt, your 2 favorites.
I want to spend a lot of time with the Springbank. It's not the best Springbank I've ever had, but I do want to unravel a lot more of that. So I wish I had a bottle of that one. But then at the NAS, I think it's just an absolute cracker. Love the nose on it more so. And if we took the Springbank out of the equation, as Igor said, then it's got to be the NAS and Lechig, which was a big surprise for me.
Yeah.
Are you glad you didn't hesitate on that NAS, Kurt?
Wow. Kurt and Lechig.
Yeah.
It's an impossible combination.
Right, guys, I'm going to need to boost, but thank you very much for hosting this and for putting this on. It's always humbling when people in the far-flung parts of the world get together and taste our whiskies and invite me along to it. So,
for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to Andrew and to Harmony and to Kurt and also to Igor.
Of course, to Igor. We got to mention Igor. Angus, thank you to you. I just want to share really quickly for me. I'm with Igor on the Glen Grant. The Springbank's my number 2, and I also really love that 30-year-old blended malt. I think it's gorgeous. The results are there. We'll keep them up for a moment, and then we're going to cut this loose. But Angus, I really appreciate you doing this for us. Look forward to it. We've got a bottling coming at some point in the not too distant future. So
not too distant, yeah. Absolutely, we're working on it. So yeah, you'll hear an update from me on that pretty soon.
Not to worry. Well, listen,
Thanks, Angus.
Thank you very much, Igor. Thanks as always, Kurt, Harmony, and everybody who took part in tonight's tasting. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll talk again soon. So have a great night.
Night,
Cheers,
Igor.
guys. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks, Igor. Bye-bye.